we're Kitty Pantry, and we're giving out free food every Friday from 1 to 3.
Me and my brother have been helping move food from the tables that people that can't carry it all together to their cars in the back.
All right. Well, hey, thank you guys for helping. What a great thing to do. What a great way to spend this time when you can't be doing other stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. Got butter?
Yeah, butter.
Get you some butter.
I'll have butter to melt.
No, we got this. All right, so we have a plethora of bread. You just need to tell us what you might like. Just maybe the one Wonder bread would be good.
Wonder?
Yeah. Wonder no more.
Sourdough or baguettes?
No, we're fine there. All right. I think the majority
Got orange juice down here.
I'd take an orange juice for sure.
Yeah. Couple white milks if you want those.
Right. Oh yeah, I'll take a couple of those. Yeah. We always drink milk. We drink lots of milk.
Cool. All right.
Well, thank you, Varnum family. It's so cool to watch your whole family coming and serving our community, just to see the boys. You guys are doing an awesome job. Thank you very much. I love our church. Well, welcome everyone to New Life Online. Thanks for hanging out with us this morning. If I haven't met you yet, my name is Gary. I'm one of the pastors here at New Life in Kittitas, and so welcome. We're starting a new teaching series on the Book of Esther this morning. Esther is fascinating. It's unique to almost any book. But before we get that, let me just share real quickly a little bit about our hopes as a church opening up again for worship for everybody. We would like to open up as quickly as possible and to be able to have worship service together. But I want you to know that we have made a commitment, the leadership, to you as a body and to our community, that we will not open up until it's safe. We'll follow the community, the health department's guidelines as far as gathering, because while we're really anxious to start worshiping together, we want to be loving to our community. And if we open up when it's not safe, what does that communicate to our community? So we are committed to being safe. And then when we do open it up, sanitizing and distancing, trying to do it in a safe manner. And so how that will look, maybe the opening up process, according to the state's phases, phase 4 is when we'll be able to all be together, and that may not be until maybe the end of July or even into August. We'll open up as soon as we can, but that's when it looks like it might be. Before that, though, we'll be able to get together in smaller groups. And so what the leadership is talking about is maybe organizing so our whole church body is in a small group that meets at somebody's home, and we can worship, watch the service together, and then worship together in a small group. So that's kind of our idea in this first stage, before we're all able to get together as a church group. Let me just say one other thing about this situation is re-entering, whether it's our business or church. I have seen, it seems like increasingly a polarization between two different groups. One group that wants to open up right now, that they're sick and tired of being all separated, and the other group that wants more and more to continue to protect and stay safe. And it seems like the divide is getting greater and greater. And here is my encouragement, especially if you're a Christ follower. Please have patience and tolerance and compassion with those other people. If you are one of the people that wants to open up right away, let me explain to everybody else. You are not a monster that just doesn't care if somebody else's kid dies. Or if you're on the other end of the spectrum, if you want to stay separated longer, it's not that it's not that you don't care about people's businesses and people's lives. You do. It seems, as I talk with different people, each one of you, regardless of what side you're on, cares about people, and that's why you're taking this stand, and it's just a different perspective. So my encouragement to you, to everybody, is let's have patience and compassion and kindness with other people, tolerance. Let's show them grace. So thank you for being willing to do that. Let's start now on the Book of Esther. This is a fascinating book that we're going to be looking at. Esther, one of the reasons why it's so unique and why you don't hear it preached about a lot is because it never, in the whole book, never mentions God one time. In addition to that, there's no message from God. There's no message to God. Nobody prays in the book of Esther. No miracles happen. It's a quick reading of it, and it almost seems like God isn't even part of the book. It is so unique. And get this, if a movie was made accurately depicting it, it would be rated somewhere in between R and X. Esther is a unique book. So much so that Martin Luther said this. He said, I am so great an enemy to the book of Esther that I wish it had not come to us at all, for it has too many heathen unnaturalities. And he's right, it does have heathen unnaturalities. The book of Esther has sex, it has violence, it has killing, it has, and not just exploitative sexual relations. It has a genocidal hatred. It has killings, mass killings in the end. It is not exactly the type of story that you read to your kids for bedtime. The book paints people of God as stuck in an evil world that they're powerless to change or to conquer or to get out of. In fact, that's a big part of what the first 2 chapters are that we're going to be looking at today. No one, as we go through Esther, no one comes off as the hero looking good. Everyone has a hidden agenda. But in a sense, isn't that kind of what life is? Real life? Doesn't it often seem that God is absent or evil is thriving, or that good things happen despite some of our impure motives? Or maybe that God's plans move forward in spite of us. Through this story of Esther, in a sense, we see life as we know it. There's a lot of very close connections that we can learn to our life. And in a sense, what we see is this book pulls back the curtain and it gives us a glimpse of God involved in our lives in a very significant and special way, so that sometimes it's hard for us to see. So that's one of the reasons why Esther is such a significant book to look at and to study and to learn about. That's why also the title that we're using for this teaching series is called Behind the Scene, because it's looking at, and you can see how it's kind of a play on words, it's looking at how God works behind what we visibly see with our eyes, with our physical eyes. And we can learn how God does His perfect work behind the scenes, working through imperfect people like you and I. In the end, we're going to see for Esther that saving the Jews isn't so much a thing accomplished by one hero, but it's accomplished by a God that it accomplishes His will, no matter how imperfect people are. And today, we're going to be looking at the first 2 chapters. And frankly, I'm telling you, I wish I could skip over these chapters, because these are difficult chapters. There's a whole lot of kind of hard and negative that we look at without positive. The story of Esther really hasn't started until after the first 2 chapters. But here's why the first 2 chapters are so important. They're important because they set the stage. If we're going to look at how God works from behind the scene to accomplish His will, we need to look at the scene and see the scenario. What is the situation where God is working? And after we see these first 2 chapters, the setup, how we understand that in our world, We live in a hard world, and we are, especially as God's people, we are often powerless to do anything about it. And so the work that God does is especially significant. Think of it, any movie maybe that you've seen, and when there's a rescue attempt, somebody's being rescued, they build it up to so you'll understand the extent of the plight of the people that are being rescued. And the greater their plight is, the more significant the rescue is. In a sense, that's what these first 2 chapters of Esther are. We are learning, frankly, the significance of the plight that Esther and the people of her day, and also we today are in the world that we live in. So chapter 1 looks at the world and the difficulties of this world that we live in. And then chapter 2 kind of shifts to us, especially as followers of God, and the powerlessness that we often feel like or actually do have. So let's look at what chapter 1, and we're going to just start at the first sentence. It starts like this. These events happened in the days of King Xerxes. Now, the first phrase gives us a lot of context there. A lot is known about King Xerxes, both from biblical sources, but also a lot from extra-biblical sources. Herodotus, a Greek historian, wrote a lot about King Xerxes. And to give you some context of when in history Xerxes was, if you think back to, let's say, the Babylonian when Nebuchadnezzar came and he conquered Jerusalem. That's in about 580 BC. And so he conquered Jerusalem and took all of the exiles back to Babylon. And then about 80 years later, let a whole bunch of the exiles go back to Israel. And then about 80 years later, there was another couple returns when Ezra brought some people back to start working on the temple, and then Nehemiah came back to start working on the walls. So after Nebuchadnezzar, the first exiles returned 80 years or so later, and then in between those two groups, right in between there, is when King Xerxes lived. And we know a lot about him from other sources too. Herodotus wrote this. He said, Xerxes regularly was an arbitrary, tyrannical, and brutal despot. That is not the kind of man you want your daughter to marry. Have you seen the movie 300? The movie 300 is based on a true battle. It's a battle of about 150,000 Persian forces that came, and they were going over the pass of Thermopylae when they were almost completely stopped by a very small band of Greeks. And the movie 300 is based on that battle. Well, that battle, that Persian force was led by King Xerxes, the one that we're going to be reading about. And so we know quite a bit about Xerxes. And then the narrator continues the story, and the next section actually tells us a lot about our situation here on earth. The narrator continues on. Xerxes reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. Basically, that's from North Africa all the way to India. Pretty much the entire known world of that time other than Greece. And so the first characteristic or reality that this first chapter goes over. See, now this chapter is obviously talking about Esther and her world and the forces of that world. But these are spiritual principles that actually apply just as much to us. And so as we look at these, I'm not going to be talking about the kingdom or the empire of Persia. I'm going to be talking about the empire of the world to help us make that transition and think about ourselves. So this empire, that was pretty much the known world. And so the first characteristic or the reality that we can learn from this empire is that this world is inescapable. That the mention of the 127 provinces what the narrator is trying to communicate is that that's a vast sweep of empire. For most people of that day, that's where they lived, and they were incapable of getting out of that or removing themselves from that situation. Similarly, for us today, we live in this broken world, and we cannot remove ourselves. We have problems that are in this world. We have political problems. We have financial problems. We have people problems. We have health problems with this virus. There's problems in this world, and we cannot escape them. We can't fix them. You know, it's interesting. About 500 years ago, when the Renaissance age started, there was a growth in our knowledge. There was a growth. Art flourished, and scientific knowledge started just growing exponentially. And this huge, rapid increase of knowledge started a new way of thinking. And this thinking is often referred to as humanism. It was thinking that we as humans are smart enough, and we're getting better and better, and we can actually rise to the point where we can overcome all of these big obstacles and problems that we face in life. But that's not what Esther says. The book of Esther says, evil and brokenness are part of the world that we live in, and we cannot escape them. They will be here until Jesus returns and defeats Satan. So the first reality that we can learn about our life is that this world is inescapable to us. And then the narrator continues on, and he introduces another concept woven in there, and it's this: the empire of this world is invincible. He references power over and over. Power. Powerful people gathering under the most powerful man on the earth. Look at what the narrator writes. At that time, Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. He invited all of the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of the provinces. The message is this is what we get, is that this is a place of significance. Here are the people who give orders that are expected to be done. And above all, here is the man who gives orders to the people who give orders. The man, as you might say, who has the codes to the nuclear briefcase. The people of God in Esther's day were under that invincible authority, just as they are today. I don't know if you remember, a few months ago, we had a missionary from China. She told a scary story of changes in China. She said now they have started using facial recognition, and they track everybody. And it's illegal to proselytize and to tell people about Jesus. And if you do, they actually track you. They know all of the people that you communicate with and friends, and they go after them. That kind of authority is scary. And if you're a Christ follower, we understand that we are a minority in this world. And it's not just China. The world is invincible. So here's the first two realities that the book of Esther is laying out for the start of Esther, but that applies to us, is that the empire of this world is inescapable. We're here. And it is invincible. So those are the first two. And while both of those realities are true, the narrator goes on to give a third interesting twist reality, is that this world is also desirable. It's visible. We can see it. And yes, it's superficial, but it's visible and it can be very impressive and desirable. Look how the narrator continues. He says, the celebration lasted 180 days, a tremendous display of opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesties. So King Xerxes put on a 6-month party that it was very impressive. And then, after that 6 months was over, it got better. Look what he says. When it was all over, the king gave a banquet for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were in the fortress of Susa. This 7-day banquet is meant to be a jaw-dropping display of opulence. The people were, in a sense, meant to kind of bow in awe at this splendor. And as I read these next words, the description, just try to picture it in your mind's eye. This elaborate display. It goes like this. It lasted for 7 days and was held in the courtyard of the palace garden. The courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons to silver rings embedded in marble pillars. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine, reflecting the king's generosity. By edict of the king, no limits were placed on drinking, for the king had instructed all of his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. And then at the same time, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. What parties! And you could travel the whole world and not see anything of this opulence. Not only is the world that we're in, that they were in, impressive, it's desirable. The world we live in, you guys, has glittering prizes. Then and now. See, our glittering prizes might look a little bit different than theirs, but it's the same message. If you embrace this could be yours. You too can hope to participate in some of its glory and share in this wealth. And we're thinking maybe, as we're seeing this wealth and power and opulence, but don't fall for it. And so as chapter 1 is winding down, we've learned that the empire of the world is inescapable. We are stuck here as part of it. It's invincible. And finally, on the surface, it may be impressive and desirable, but you guys, it's a dangerous environment where the people of God have to live because there's nowhere else to go. So then that's the narrator as he sets the scene for the world that not only Esther is in, but that we are in. Then he kind of shifts to our place, to Esther's place in this world. And he gives different cameos of how we on our own are weak in this world that we're in. So look at this first cameo that he gives. This is what he's going to be talking about. The first one, if you're writing notes, write this down. The people of God are under exploitative power. To live in the empire of this world means to be under exploitative power. We'll see a number of examples as we go through this story of how Esther was under that power. The narrator continues on. On the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us that Xerxes was a notorious womanizer. And we see that here. So when his male companions that they had been with, when they had their fill of talking about money and power, the conversation shifted to sex. And we can imagine kind of the body conversation that might have taken place, each man trying to up the other person. And we get to right here where you can kind of imagine the scene where Xerxes says, well, okay, I've spent the last 6 months showing you my inanimate objects, my possessions. Now, let me show you my animate object, my possession, Queen Vashti. And so he sends for her. And did you notice the description? She is to wear the royal crown. He doesn't specify anything else. His purpose is to display her beauty to all of his friends. Maybe we understand why she said no. But one of the important things to understand is that she may have had the title of queen, but with that, she had no power. And she really didn't have a choice to say no. So you can imagine Xerxes' response. The narrator tells us about it. But when they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. It must have been a terrible moment for those eunuchs to have to come and whisper into the king's ear. You can just see him start to get upset, and as the crowd started to murmur, maybe they were texting or going hashtag Vashti said no. The king was embarrassed and ashamed, and so he asked his advisors how he should respond, and they encouraged him. You are king. Nobody can say no to you. And if your wife says no, what kind of a example will that be to other women, to other people in your kingdom? You have to take a firm stand. So he struck her down, as didn't kill her, but made her so she wasn't queen anymore. The empire of the world, you guys, is not a place where we should expect justice or consistency. It's a place where arbitrary power is commonplace, where people are exploited. Look at how the story continues. So his personal attendant suggested, let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa. Haggai, the king's eunuch in charge of the harem, will see that they are all given beauty treatments. After that, the young woman who most pleases the king, and that's pleases in bed, will be made queen instead of Vashti. This advice, interestingly enough, was appealing to the king. So he put the plan into effect. This is maybe not surprising, but the competition was actually a sex contest, with the winner being whoever can please the king the most in their night with him. Anybody who says the Bible is a boring book hasn't read Esther. Unfortunately, we see this system of the world that we're in and that Esther was in is utterly heartless. Here is a Miss Persian competition. But there's no choice in it. If you were pretty, you were entered into it. And it's not ultimately a beauty contest. It's a sex contest. This is an appalling abuse of power. The pretty young women are taken away from the men who might have hoped to marry them. And they're incarcerated in a harem of the most powerful man in the world. So that's the first characteristic of weakness that we note, is that for most of us, and certainly for the people of God, living in this world means living under exploitive power. We inhabit a world where powerful people treat other people as existing just for their benefit. In the story that we've seen so far, there has been no connection yet to God or anything else in the Old Testament. And that is just about to change. Now, the narrator we see makes a connection. Look what he says as he continues on. At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa whose name was Mordecai. And so what's important about this is it goes on, he's a Jewish man, he's one of the exiles. His relatives were taken from Israel, and he is now living there in the capital. And in the next verse, as the narrator goes on, he mentions exile 4 different ways, that word. And the emphasis really is that Mordecai is an exile. And then the next verse goes on to talk about his cousin, his young cousin, Esther, who is also an exile. Look what it says. The man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. Esther is an orphan, which just including that speaks to the powerlessness that she has. But it's interesting that the narrator includes both of her names. And here's why I think he does. I think his goal is to communicate in this world that we're stuck in, there's a tension of what we're going to identify with. And that's really the next weakness or position that we find ourselves in, if you're taking notes. And it's this, that to live in the world is to have a tension of identity. See, Hadassah was her Jewish name, and Esther was her Persian name. And ultimately, she was going to have to decide if she was first and foremost going to identify with her Jewish roots, or if she was going to embrace the opulence of the palace and identify with her Persian place. Ultimately, we as Christ followers have that same decision, or everybody has that same decision. A few months ago when we were looking at 1 Peter, that was one of the primary themes going through 1 Peter, is that we will have to choose our identity. Will we see ourselves as first and foremost of this world, identifying with the values and the desires and the goals of this world? Or will we first and foremost see ourselves as disciples of Jesus, identifying with His heart and His passions and His values? We, just like Esther, have a tension of identity. Who and what are we going to identify with? Who is Esther going to identify with? The narrator continues on. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Haggai's care. So Esther was taken. She didn't have a choice. That's a pretty vulnerable position to be in. And that's the third identity or thing that this chapter talks about, who we are as people. We are in a vulnerable position. In fact, the narrator continues on and increases our understanding of how vulnerable Esther was by saying Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to. Esther's silence points to an atmosphere of danger. Clearly, the empire of the world is a dangerous place, especially if you are a person of God. It's not just if there's an unpredictable despot on the throne. It is part of this world. What a contrast. You have the king whose glory and majesty are emphatically emphasized and displayed. And then there's a people who need to be invisible to protect themselves, to keep a low profile because of how vulnerable they are. When we are in this world, we are in a position of being vulnerable. Esther, in her vulnerability, is a picture of believers, an exile in a God-hating world that exercises great power. Well, let's look at how the narrator continues on. Before each young woman was taken to the king's bed, she was given the prescribed 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months with oil of myrrh, followed by 6 months with special perfumes and ointments. When it was time for her to go to the king's palace, she was given her choice of whatever clothing or jewelry she wanted to take from the harem. That evening, she was taken to the king's private rooms, and the next morning she was brought to the second harem, where the king's wives lived. There she would be under the care of Shagzaz, the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines. She would never go to the king again unless he especially enjoyed her and requested her by name. The harem, if you caught that, was divided into 2 sections. There was the section for the virgins, and then there was the harem for the concubines. That's the women who had already slept with the king. In the harem for the virgins, a girl was put there because she was beautiful, and then she was almost like a lamb being fattened up for slaughter. She was giving beauty treatments to prepare her for her night with the king, and she was put in order, queued up. When her turn came, she could choose her lingerie, her perfume, whatever she wanted. And then after that night with the king, the girl would then be transferred to the concubines, which was a sad change of status. See, she wouldn't have another night with the king unless he asked specifically for her. But she couldn't leave and get married and continue on with her life. Once she had slept with the king, nobody else would marry her. It would be unthinkable to do that with one of the king's women. They would spend probably the rest of their lives in seclusion, except for one girl that the king would choose as queen. This heartless system is how the world works in the absence of the fear of God. Other people exist for what you could do for me. If I get power, I will make it to serve my purposes. That is the way of the world. The other men in the empire, besides Xerxes, were no different. They would have done the same thing. In fact, most of the women were no different. They would manipulate and do whatever they needed to do or could do to better their circumstances. That's human nature. The default ways of the world that we live in. So now we see Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in the early winter of the 7th year of the reign. So it gives the dates. This whole process that we've talked about this morning actually has taken 4 years, slowly developing and getting Esther ready. And then you can just kind of picture her walking through the courts of the harem, the halls of the harem, to the palace. Much hinges on this one night of immoral sex. The salvation of the Jewish nation hangs seemingly in the balance. How will Esther do? We see. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. But before we start the music and celebrate, remember that the crown now on Esther's head doesn't give her power. It just means she is the puppet of the king for his pleasure and no more. Just like the crown on Vashti's head. It doesn't give her any more power than, say, one of the wives of King Henry VIII. She's in a deeply fragile and vulnerable position. Weakness. And yet, we see that somehow, maybe through a number of huge coincidences, she finds herself in the position of a king, or of a queen. But remember, the story really itself hasn't started yet. These chapters are just setting the scene. And instead, chapters 1 and 2 that we've looked at this morning show us the world that we live in. As we live in this empire of the world, and this is our situation. We can't escape it. And especially as people of God, this is our position. The main point that we can take from these two chapters is that the world is a dangerous place for the weak people of God. Yet, we have to live here. And we're not supposed to respond with fear, for we sneaked a peek at the end of the book. We saw that God, through a number of those coincidences, still brought about his ends. God is working. So, understanding those realities of the world that we're living in, we can still remember that God behind the curtain is at work. Esther was weak and vulnerable, but there was something more going on, just as in our lives. So to simplify it, we can say in chapter 1, it gives us a portrayal of the power of this world. And in chapter 2, we learn of the weakness of Esther and of us. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, what an unconventional book Esther is. You don't hear a lot of sermons on it, partly because of that, but also, I think, partly because of the first few chapters are so hard. It seemed like negative and without a lot of positive or hopeful things happening. But I think it's so important to understand these chapters, because if we understand the position that we're in, we will understand even more how significant it is that God is here. God is working in our lives. God is working. Have you ever seen the movie Rocky, the first classic Rocky movie? You know, if you go through, the movie does kind of similar to what the Book of Esther does. It builds the characters, and at the beginning, it's pretty sad. I mean, you have this dysfunctional guy with a very dysfunctional family filled with problems in his life. But then, as you see him rising and conquering over those, because of how bleak the situation was at the beginning, it gives it that much more inspiration and glory and excitement at the end, when he almost conquers. Similarly, when we understand, as Christians or people of this world, the position that we're in, if we understand how, in a sense, bleak and hopeless and exploitative it is, it gives God that much more glory when he works his purposes in spite of that. Let me read one last verse, bringing that in, on showing how God uses weakness to achieve his ends. In 1 Corinthians 1:18, it says this. Paul writes, "The message of the cross is foolish to those who are headed for destruction, But we who are being saved know it is the very power of God. The cross, you guys, is the ultimate display of weakness. This is in this world that exemplifies, that glorifies power and conquering and status. The cross, being crucified, is the ultimate display of weakness. But it's the ultimate triumph of God, the ultimate glory bringing about, God working through the weakness of this world, of people in this world. God brings about His purposes. And that's what we're going to see as we work through the rest of this book. How in spite of the bleakness of the world, God manipulates and brings about His purpose. We can have hope in spite of our situation. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you. Thank you that you are behind the curtain, that you are active, involved in our lives, pulling strings. Lord, we worship you. God, as we see how you acted and learn how you acted through the book of Esther, my prayer is that you may be glorified and that we may have hope, new hope. In your name, amen. Amen. Shall we worship?